Okay, so
There we go.
my name is Joe Unwin. I'm also known as FlowJoe. Um, I'm currently a community content creator, and I absolutely love the Power Platform, and most notably Power Automate. My day-to-day role is a senior Power Platform developer for a Microsoft partner. I'm from a pro dev background, so I've been working in the automation development and testing side for over 10 years, similarly to what UI flows do now. I create a lot of content that actually breaks down pro dev complexity for people that don't necessarily have a developer background. So check out my blog if that's something of interest to you. And obviously, we've got quite a lot to get through today. So if anyone has any questions, you'll have an opportunity at the end because I probably won't be able to see them while I'm flying through this information. Right, so that's enough about me. Let's actually get into it. So we're here today to talk about an introduction to custom connectors and APIs. Who is this actually aimed at? Well, we saw with UI flows that people that don't actually have APIs for their backend services, etc., they can use that to grab data. But what if your business has a service that's already connected to the internet and most notably has an API? Well, if there is a business requirement for you to actually get data from your service into the Power Platform, custom connectors fulfills that role. Or if you're using a third-party connection that's out of the Microsoft remit, say you're using a HR website, such as Bamboo HR, they provide API access so that you can actually pull information from third parties directly into the Power Platform, and you can even populate CDS, etc. Now, I just want to go through an overview of actually what we're going to be looking at today then. So we're firstly going to be looking at what are APIs. We're then going to be looking at what are they actually used for. I'm then going to show you a pre-built custom connector that we're actually going to build live towards the end of the actual demonstration. And we're actually going to then see how APIs are actually connected to custom connectors. And then we're going to ultimately create our custom connector. So before I start with everything, I'm just going to say something about REST APIs. I'm going to put a little blurb up on the screen that I'm going to read through. And it's going to sound really complicated, but I'm going to break it down and show you that APIs and their architecture, etc., are really something not to be feared, especially for those people that don't have a developer background. Okay, so representational state transfer is a software architectural style that defines a set of constraints to be used for creating web services. Web services that conform to REST architectural style called RESTful web services provide interoperability between computer systems on the internet. Now that just sounds really complicated. I mean, that's crazy, right? But what it actually is just an architectural procedure that allows transfer between two systems on the internet in a structured way. And the structured way we're actually going to be using is REST, because that's what's currently used within custom connectors. Now, currently, Logic Apps has another API, which is SOAP. It's currently in preview, but we're not going to touch on that at the moment. But that's just to give you a background of there are multiple different types of API architecture, and we're going to be focusing on REST. We're also going to be using HTTP request, which is a GET request. We're just going to be getting information, but you can actually post changes, you can delete everything, but we're going to just be focusing on retrieving data from a third party today. Okay, so what is an API? Well, an API is known as an application programming interface. And the best way I can describe this is it effectively lists a bunch of operations that developers can use along the way with a description about what it actually does. And how I like to present this to people that don't really have a development background is just think of it as a menu. You have a menu. You're in a restaurant. You're looking at different types of dishes. You have like a title of what it is, such as a cheeseburger with fries. And then you have a description about what the actual dish contains. And then when you've decided what you want, you make a request. You talk to the server and say, okay, I'd like a cheeseburger with a Coke. Great. So the server goes away and you're just sat at your table. You actually don't know what's going on right now. You have some idea that the server's gone to the kitchen. The kitchen is then preparing your food, and then you get your food back to you. You get a response. Now, this is how APIs work. You'll have an API that will give you information. It will have something that will describe what you can actually do, what you can request. You then make a request, you wait, and it goes off to the server. The service actually processes all of this information, and then you get a response back. But what if there's security? Well, let's use this whole menu process as an example. If I'm at a restaurant and I decide to get a cheeseburger and Coke and I make a request, but I need to provide a password to my server before I can actually order anything, but I don't know the password, my order is never going to get to the kitchen, right? It's the same with an API. If I don't have, for example, an API key, which we'll talk about later, I can't authenticate, and then I won't be able to get information back from that service. So, what is an API in summary? An API is an application programming interface. An API lists operations that you can use. An API makes life easier for developers because you have a set list of instructions that you can follow to retrieve, update, and delete data. An API controls access to resources through security, etc. And then APIs are ultimately used for communication between services. Right then. So how do custom connectors come into this? Well, imagine I need to make an API request. So I do a HTTP request to a third-party service. Okay, so I've made a request to a third-party API, and I get a response back. I get some data back. How does this fit into custom connectors? Well, this is the custom connector. This is one single action. Now, if you've used Microsoft Flow Power Automate before, and you have gone into your triggers, you've added a trigger, and then you go into actions, well, you'll see all these different types of actions that you can add. And when we create a custom connector, we can add different actions to our custom connector. Now, the action effectively is one API request. And we're going to see this when I walk you through the demonstration momentarily. And security then obviously comes into play. When I make the request, I need to provide some security information. Now, some APIs don't actually require any authentication, but if you're working with a business, you're more than likely going to have some authentication unless you want everyone to have access to your data on the internet. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch to my browser and walk through a demonstration. Now, my demonstration is based on cryptocurrencies. Now, you don't need to worry about what cryptocurrencies are or how they work, because it's a really complex, it's really complex design, etc. And we obviously haven't got time to talk about that. But what I'm using cryptocurrencies for is to simply exchange a fiat currency, which is US dollars, pounds, euros, etc., into a cryptocurrency. So I can see how much money it costs for me to buy a particular crypto coin. So it's simply just a exchange rate transfer mechanism. Okay, so let's actually look at the previously built custom connector. So you can see here I've got 3 that I've been working on. We're looking at the cryptocurrency now, but I'm using third parties to talk to NASA to get the weather on Mars, or I can see all the near Earth objects from NASA as well. But let's just go into our cryptocurrency connector then. Now, there are three main stages in a custom connector that you have to focus on. When you first create your custom connector, you're going to be providing a name, and then you have a section which is called General. Here, you just simply provide information on what it actually is, so some kind of like description. Then you need to provide a URL. Now, this may trip some people over. When you actually grab an API URL, you just want to grab the first part, the actual API URL base, which is known as the host. So if I go in here and I just look at this URL right here, you can see it's got a load of forward slashes, it's got question marks, it's got all of this stuff, but I just need to get this information, because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be selecting the scheme when creating it. So I've already got my HTTPS there. I just need to provide the host. And because I want to access everything in this API, I've just got a base URL of /. Now, then you get onto the security section. Within this example that we're going to be building today, we're going to be using an API key. And I'm going to be speaking more about security later in the presentation. But an API key, if you're just getting started, just think of it as a token that's like a password that goes off to a service. It gets checked, it gets validated, and if it's correct, it will allow me access to the backend server. And I'm passing it through a parameter of a header. I'm going to talk about this a lot more later because it's slightly complex, but I just want to kind of show you what we're going to be doing today. And then in the definition, now you heard me talk about the different actions that you have in Flow. Well, this is where you create it. This is where you actually create your API requests in the definition. So I've got one single action here on my custom connector, which is get the latest coin price. And I've got a description of I can provide a coin ID to get the latest price, and then you have a unique identifier. But then if you scroll down, you have something called a request. Now, this is where we was talking about when we've seen the menu and we make a request. Just the same with an API, you need to make a request to the external service. And you can do this by importing a sample. And obviously, when we build this, I'm going to go into more detail. But what I really want to show you here is the different parameters that you can actually use. So you have path parameters and query parameters. And this is how we actually pass data from Power Automate to our custom connector when we've got a flow run, so that we can manipulate the request to retrieve the information that we require. Okay, so that's an overview of a custom connector. Let's actually see one then. So if I go into my flows, I've got two examples. I've got a manual one and one with Power Apps. So I'm actually going to show you a custom connector being called from Power Apps and seeing how the whole flow goes from Power Apps to Flow to custom connector and back again. But firstly, let me just quickly show you what it looks like in Flow. Now I've got a manual trigger here, and as you can see, I've got an action which is get latest coin price. Now this is the custom connector that I've built. So if I click on new action and click custom, you will see your custom connector here. And once you select your custom connector, you'll see the action. So if we go back to the actual custom connector at the moment, you can see there's only one action. So if I wanted to make another API request, rather than creating a whole nother custom connector, what I have to do is add another action, and it will appear here. So once I select that, it will be added, and I'll have something like this. I'll have my parameters that I can pass through. So I can pass in Bitcoin, BTC at the moment, the currency that I want to use, which is US dollars, and then I've got a time period of within the last minute, I want to know how much Bitcoin costs in US dollars and how many trades there's been. And then I generate a HTML table. So if I just quickly test this and run the flow, you will now see within 1 second, we've gone to a third party, we've authenticated, we've made a request, we've got some information back, and if we just open this up, you can see it's returned in JSON, and you can see all of the different data that we get returned. So within the last minute, We've got the price open for Bitcoin at $9,400 and it closed at $9,400. So there wasn't much change within the last minute of the price of Bitcoin. So let's actually see this in action with a Power App. Now, what I'm doing here is I've just kicking off my flow from a Power App. I'm using my custom connector, and then I'm passing the information back to my Power App. So this is the demonstration application that I've created. It's just a simple application where I can select a coin, the time limit, the currency, etc. And then it's just going to display me the price over here. So as this conference really is based in Europe, let's choose euros. We're going to check how much Bitcoin's cost in euros and the time limit of a minute. So if we just press save, it's going to go off to flow. The flow is going to run. It's going to connect to the custom connector. I mean, look, it's already happened. I can't even speak as fast as it's happening. It's then going to go to the third-party service API, come back to the custom connector, which is then in the flow, and then pass back to Power Automate. And we can see that Bitcoin price is 8,706 euros, and there was 10 Bitcoins traded in the last minute. Awesome. Right, so let's get back to our slideshow. So what have we actually just seen then? We've seen that a custom connector gets information from a third party. We've seen that it uses security to authenticate. We then have seen that it uses a flow action to make an individual API call. We have also seen that we can use parameters to pass information from our flow to our custom connector and change the request that we're actually making. And we then retrieve some information back. Now, obviously, we're looking at getting information at the moment. Now, what happens if we updated information? Well, if we updated information, we're still going to get some information back. It's not necessarily going to be information that we've requested. It's going to be something like, yes, this has worked, or no, it hasn't. We're going to get a response back. Okay, so we've talked about passing data then. How do we pass data? Well, I showed you query parameters. Now, how do query parameters work? Well, on websites such as YouTube, you'll see it will have a question mark, v equals, and then it will have some kind of information passed in. What that's doing is it's actually passing in the video ID via a query parameter. And what we're doing with our cryptocurrency here is we're using the Coin API, REST API, which is the third-party service. And then we've got a question mark here. Now, this period underscore ID is the query parameter that we're actually using. And the 1 minute is the information that we're passing in. So when we actually paste this into our custom connector, it will automatically pick up that this is a query because it has the equal sign which separates the actual query from the information that we pass in. But path parameters are slightly more complicated. So a path parameter is the actual URL being changed. So where we've got the forward slashes, we've got /BTC, which represents Bitcoin, /USD, which represents United States dollars. Now, how do we actually change this? Because if we paste that in, there's nothing signifying that this is actually a path parameter. Well, what you need to do is you need to use these little squiggly brackets here. So if you put squiggly bracket around a BTC and a squiggly bracket around a USD, that's going to tell Power Automate that this custom connector is going to, this custom connector action is going to have path parameters. And whatever you put between these squiggly brackets is what's going to show up as the ID when someone selects the action. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, a little bit complicated, but when we're actually creating this, you'll see what I mean by these squiggly little brackets. Okay, so security. There are 4 types of security that you can actually use with your custom connector. Now, how do I know what security I want to use if my business has provided me with an API? Well, they should also provide you with the information that you need. Now, it's more than likely not going to be no authentication, because if it is, we don't have to pass anything and everyone on the internet has access. But if you're using something like an API key, It's a single token that's been generated, which is effectively a password that gets authenticated. You will get that from your developers. Or if you're using something like I am, which is a third party, there will be some kind of generational API key where you'll provide an email address and they'll email it to you. Okay, so what's basic authentication then? Well, basic authentication is just two tokens, primarily a username and a password. It's just like logging into your Windows laptop. You'll provide a username, you'll provide a password. And then you have something called OAuth. Now, OAuth is a completely different beast compared to the rest. It's a protocol that allows users to grant limited access to resources on one site to another without actually having to expose their credentials. And it uses access tokens and granted permissions, etc. It's quite complicated, but if you're using OAuth, you'll be provided with the information that you require to use this. But the majority of, especially third-party APIs that you'll be using will most likely be using an API key, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So let's actually get going and build a custom connector. Right, so we're on the custom connectors page. You can click, so if you don't know where the custom connectors is, I should probably tell you this. Under data, there it says custom connectors, and then at the top right, you have new custom connector. Now you can select from blank, which is what we're going to be doing today, so that we have fundamental knowledge of how a custom connector is built. But as you get more advanced, if you're using larger API systems, etc., you can actually import files that will pre-build a custom connector for you, such as importing from a Postman collection or importing from an Open API file, or even Azure services. It's currently in preview though. Okay, so let's click on Create from Blank, and let's just name this Demo. So you're providing a custom connector name. Awesome. So we've generated our custom connector. We can then upload an image that represents what our service is. We can change the background color. We can provide a description. And then what we need to do here is actually provide where the API is. So if we go back to this website, this is the API website that I'm using. And I want to just show you how similar it is to a menu. So I've got my little header here. So imagine this says burger. Well, it just says latest data, right? I have a description of what it is. I have an example. So that would be obviously an image in a restaurant, but we've got then an example request here. And then I've just got some information here about what parameters I can use, which effectively would be the ingredients in a menu. So over here, it actually provides me with examples that have been used and then some return data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this URL because this is what I want to use. I want to request the coin latest data within the last period of whatever I choose. So let's go back here and paste it into here. Now, if you remember previously, I said if you provide the HTTPS, it's going to give you a little trip up. It's because it just wants the host. So you need to delete the HTTPS and select it here. Or if you're using HTTP, select HTTP. You then want to remove any excess of the URL. You just want the .com, .io, .co.uk, .eu, anything like that. And that's the host. Now in the base URL, as I said before, if we look back at this URL, it's using /v1/OHLCV. Doesn't really mean much to us at the moment, but I want to be able to make a request to anything on this API. So you can actually specifically state, I only want to use this section of an API by adding your / here. But I want to have access to everything, so just put a / and leave it at that. And let's move on to security. Now, security is what we was just talking about. I'm going to use an API key. Now, how do I know I need to use an API key? Well, if I go back to this website here, it says that I can generate a free API key down here. It also provides me an example of how the API key is expected. So it's expected via a header. So rather than a query, which would be added onto the end of the URL, I have to actually provide it within the header context of an API. And this is what the actual key token is. So I need to copy that, come into here, and I'm going to pass an API key and pass through the parameter, which is the API context that they're expecting within a header. So if I press next, that's security done. I don't need to do anything there. When someone then uses this custom connector, they're going to have to make a connection by providing the API key at that particular point. Okay, so now we want to actually create an action. So let's click New Action. And previously we wanted to get the latest coin price, right? And we're just getting coin price, time provided. Now, the operation ID is a unique identifier because obviously if we have multiple actions, we need to separate that. They may be doing very similar stuff, so let's just call this get latest coin price. You can't have any spaces, you have to use dashes, etc. It's a unique identifier. You can effectively do what you want there. So then let's move down to the request section. So if we click on import from sample, we get this little side pop up here. So as I said before, we can delete, we can like change information, etc. with these different HTTP verbs, but we're just using get at the moment. So if I paste, oops, I need the URL first, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? If I grab this URL and I come back here and I go to import from sample, select my verb and paste that, I'm going to be making a request to this URL with this information, obviously with the security that I've provided. But I told you about squiggly brackets before. So this is /BTC, so I know this is the cryptocurrency. So if I just put a squiggly bracket and write cryptocurrency and close a squiggly bracket here, what that's going to do is it's going to tell Power Automate that the information that I've provided within this squiggly bracket here is a parameter. It's going to be something that I'm going to be expecting the user to pass through. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with US dollars, where I'm just going to be passing through a currency. But I'm not actually going to do anything with the query parameters because that already gets done for you. So if I hit import there and I scroll down, you can see that my path parameters have been added here. And I've got my query parameter. And you can actually go into this and edit it as well. So I've got the name as Crypto, so that should be crypto. Let's change that. And you can actually add a default value. Now, why did I want to show you the default value? Say you're actually doing requests to an API constantly, and the default value, say, is in English, and you want to pass through the value of English, you can provide that constantly to the user so they don't have to keep putting a value in. They'll have to delete it out and then change that value if they want to change it, but it will automatically pre-populate when you create a flow and add this action. And then you can change how the type is, etc. in here. So let's go back here, and you can see that it's updated. Oops, what's happened there? Okay, cool. So if we do create connector now, oh, unable to save definition. There you go. I've changed it by accident. Let's start. Let's just copy back. That was my fault for not spelling correctly. And just change this to currency and import. Okay, and then once you click create connector, what's actually going to happen is this is the point that you're going to save. If you haven't clicked create connector yet and you go out of this, everything is lost. So make sure you click create connector. And at this point, you can go on to do some testing. But rather than go on to do some testing, let's just jump straight in and actually look at this being used in a flow. Now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a generic flow, which is going to be instant. So I'm going to add a manual trigger. I'm going to call this demo. Click create and add new step. So as I said before, all you have to do is click on custom. And you can see that our demo custom connector that we've just created appears here. So if I select that, you can then see get latest coin price demo. Great, we've just created this. Let's actually see it in action then. So I need to create a connection name here for this now. So I'm just going to call this API key. And then I need to pass in an API key. Now, obviously, I don't want to give you guys what my API key is. So if you go onto the website, you can generate your own if you're going to copy what I've done today. I click create. That's going to go away and create my connection. And effectively, we now have some sort of security API key being passed through to our third party. So we saw cryptocurrency and currency be added, and that was part of the URL here. So we had /BTC/USD. So I can actually pass that information through. Or I can use a different cryptocurrency such as Ethereum. I can use US dollars, and I need to pass in 1 minute. Now, how do I know what information I need to pass into this period query parameter? Well, if you are on here on the website, it gives you all of the information that you can use within the periods. So as you can see here, for seconds, I need to do 1 sec, 2 sec. For hours, 1 hours, days, 1 day, etc. So that's how I know what information I need to pass through. And that's how I pre-populated these fields to actually contain the information that someone would need to select to pass through. Awesome. So if we just hit save then, and once that's saved, hit test and perform a trigger action. We continue saying that we want to use the connection, run flow. Okay, so we've run the flow now, and we've gone to the third party with the parameter that we passed through of Ethereum, United States dollars, and within the last minute. And we've got the data back here. So you can see Ethereum opened in US dollars at $199, and then it closed at $198, so it actually lost $1 within that minute period. So that's just a simple way of creating a custom connector and using it in a flow. Awesome. So we've created our first custom connector then, and it really didn't take that long, did it? It was really not complicated, especially if you've got an API, because you are provided with all the information. All you're doing is just pre-populating fields in the custom connector build section to actually connect to a third-party service and bring it back to Power Automate. Okay, so let's recap then. We've learned what an API is. We've seen an API in action and learned what they're actually used for. We've seen a custom connector. We've used our new knowledge or previous knowledge, if you've already had knowledge of APIs, to actually make an action in a custom connector. And then we've ultimately built our first custom connector. So what next then? What can you actually do to start learning this? Well, I've got some resources here for you guys. So I've actually extensively, I blog a lot and I create videos a lot, and I've extensively written about this subject. So if you go to bit.ly/custom connectors, you'll get all of the blog posts, videos, etc. Surrounding custom connectors that go into even more depth than we have time to talk about today. We also learn about APIs, and if you want to learn more about APIs, then if you go to bit.ly/learn APIs, it will have more information about how you can do requests as well as changes to data, as well as delete data, create data, etc. And we've used APIs, a third-party API that is free. Now, when you're actually starting out and learning with custom connectors, I advise you to use a third-party API just so that you can play around and you don't actually have an effect on your in-house data. And if you actually go to bit.ly/free APIs, it's a community-driven GitHub repository that actually has a list of all public APIs that you can use, ranging from animals to food and drink to music to weather, video, etc. It tells you what type of authentication it uses. It tells you if it's HTTPS, and it provides you with all of the information that you need to get started with third-party APIs. And this is a great resource to just play around with. It's where I found the NASA API. It's where I found the cryptocurrency API. And it's something that I definitely suggest that everyone takes a look at, especially if you want to start learning about custom connectors. Okay, then. So do we have any questions?
Let me see. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this session. It was really, really, really good. So I love it that you make it so simple for everybody to understand the pretty difficult subjects actually for a lot of people. And I think that yeah, if I look at all the comments, they are really happy with the session as well. There was one question by Antti. He asked, what websites do people use to update exchange rates in D365?
I don't actually know what websites people use to. I'm assuming it's multiple different websites, but I can take a look at what's generally used within the community and get back to Antti.
Yeah, I think that it will probably be something paid because, of course, you need to be able to trust those people, of course.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You need to make sure that it's on time as well, right?
Exactly. So yeah.
I see another question
Yeah.
from Philip there. Really good info. Is there anything to be careful with OAuth? Not necessarily. It's just slightly more complex than pasting a simple string character set into your security, such as an API. It just it just is a little bit more complex. There's files involved, etc. If you're really interested in learning about OAuth, the web has an abundance of resources that have step-by-step guides that make it really easy. But if you're especially using an in-house solution that you want to connect to the Power Automate section, then just speak to the developers that have actually developed it, and they will be able to provide you with all the information, all of the files, etc., that you need to get authenticated.